If you're watching this and thinking about someone you love who's been silently carrying everyone else's burdens, please don't look away. This story needs to be heard. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd have to beg for basic respect in her own son's house. At 62, after giving everything I had to everyone I loved, I found myself standing in a kitchen that didn't feel like home anymore, holding a newspaper with job listings that might as well have been written in a foreign language. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the quiet rage that builds up when you realize the people you sacrificed everything for see you as nothing more than a burden they can't wait to dispose of. My name is Maria, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. It started so gradually that I almost didn't notice. After my husband passed away 8 years ago, Daniel, my only son, my pride and joy, invited me to move in with his family. "Mom, we need you," he said, his voice warm with what I thought was genuine affection. "The kids adore their grandmother, and Sarah could use help with the house while I focus on building my practice." I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. I packed up the little apartment I'd been struggling to afford on my widow's pension and moved into their beautiful suburban home with such hope in my heart. Finally, I thought, I could be useful again. I could matter. After feeling so lost and purposeless following my husband's death, the idea of being needed felt like salvation. For the first few months, it was everything I'd dreamed of. I'd wake up early to prepare breakfast for everyone, pack Daniel's lunch with the same care I'd shown when he was in elementary school, walk little Emma to the bus stop while holding Tommy's hand as he chattered about dinosaurs and playground adventures. Sarah seemed grateful for the help, and Daniel would kiss my cheek before leaving for work, calling me his lifesaver. I threw myself into their lives completely. I learned Emma's favorite bedtime stories by heart, helped Tommy with his reading, organized playmates and birthday parties. I cooked family dinners every night, real meals with vegetables the children actually ate because I'd figured out how to make them fun. I kept that house spotless, doing laundry before anyone even realized it was dirty, making sure Daniel's shirts were pressed perfectly for his important meetings. I thought I was building something beautiful. I thought I was earning my place in their lives through love and service. But love, I was about to learn, doesn't always protect you from cruelty. The first sign came when Sarah started working part-time at a local boutique. Suddenly, my help wasn't as appreciated as it once was. "Oh, you don't need to do that, Maria," she'd say when I offered to handle the grocery shopping or take the kids to their activities. But it wasn't said with kindness. It was said with the tone you'd use to dismiss someone whose assistance had become more inconvenient than helpful. Daniel began coming home later, claiming work pressure. But I could see something else in his eyes when he looked at me. Where there had once been warmth, there was now a distance that made my stomach twist with anxiety I couldn't name. The grandchildren, picking up on subtle signals that children are so sensitive to, began treating me differently too. Emma, who used to climb into my lap for stories, started saying she was too old for grandma stories. Tommy, who had called me his best friend, began asking why I was always here in a way that made my heart crack a little more each time. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I need you to know that you're not alone. Please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps us continue sharing these stories that matter. Also, comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to know that my voice is reaching women who understand this pain. I started noticing the small exclusions that cut deeper than any harsh word could have. Family photos on social media that somehow never included me, even though I was the one taking most of them. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Plans made for weekend activities that didn't include Grandma because she might be tired, or it might be too much for her. The house began to feel less like a home and more like a workplace where I was an employee whose services were no longer quite adequate. I found myself tiptoeing around, trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. I'd wait until everyone was asleep to shower so I wouldn't inconvenience anyone. I'd eat smaller portions at dinner so there would be more for the family. I started saying sorry for things that weren't my fault, for simply existing in spaces where I'd once felt welcome. And still, I convinced myself it was temporary. Families go through phases, I told myself. People get busy, stressed, distracted. My Daniel was working so hard to provide for everyone. Sarah was adjusting to her new job. The children were just growing up, becoming independent. This distance, this coldness, it would pass. It had to pass. I was so naive. I thought love was enough to protect us from hurting each other. I thought the years I'd spent sacrificing my own needs, my own dreams, my own financial security for his future would count for something when I needed patience and understanding in return. I had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March, when my arthritis was flaring so badly that I could barely grip my coffee cup. I'd been living with Daniel's family for 3 years by then, watching the warmth in their eyes slowly freeze into something I didn't recognize. But that morning, everything changed with a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I was coming down the hallway, moving slowly because my knees were screaming with every step, when I heard Sarah's voice coming from the kitchen. She was talking to her sister on the phone, and her words hit me like a physical blow. "I don't know how much longer we can do this, Lisa," she was saying, her voice filled with an exasperation that made my blood run cold. "She's always here, always underfoot, always watching us like she's waiting for us to fail at something so she can swoop in and fix it. It's exhausting having someone constantly hovering, constantly needing to feel useful." I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid they might hear it from the kitchen. "Daniel's getting frustrated too," Sarah continued. "He won't say it directly, but I can tell. She eats our food, uses our utilities, takes up space. And what does she contribute? She can't even keep up with the housework anymore. Last week I found dust on the ceiling fans. Dust. And don't get me started on how she coddles the kids. Emma's becoming a complete baby, always running to Grandma instead of handling her own problems." The cruelty in her voice when she said Grandma made something inside my chest crumble. This was the woman I'd supported through 2 difficult pregnancies, whose tears I'd dried when she worried about money, whose children I'd rocked to sleep through countless nights when she was too exhausted to function. "Maybe it's time for Daniel to have that conversation," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "You know, about other living arrangements. There are some nice senior communities around here, places where she'd be with people her own age instead of making us all feel guilty for living our lives." Senior communities. The phrase hit me like a slap. She was talking about getting rid of me like I was an old piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. I managed to make it back to my room without being discovered, but I couldn't stop shaking. I sat on the edge of my bed, the same bed I'd been so grateful for 3 years ago, and tried to process what I'd just heard. This was how they really saw me. Not as a family member, not as someone who'd given up her own independence to help them build their lives, but as a burden they were plotting to remove. The next few weeks were torture. Every interaction felt poisoned by what I now knew. When Daniel would ask about my day, I could hear the impatience beneath his forced interest. When Sarah would thank me for helping with dinner, I could see the calculation in her eyes. Was this worth the inconvenience of having me around? The children, sensing the shift in their parents' attitudes, began treating me differently too. Emma, who was now 9, started rolling her eyes when I offered to help with her homework. "Mom says I need to be more independent," she'd say, using the same dismissive tone I'd heard Sarah use about me. Tommy, only 6 but already learning to mirror his family's behavior, began ignoring me when I called his name. When I asked him about school, he'd shrug and walk away, leaving me standing there talking to empty air. The loneliness was suffocating. I'd wake up each morning in a house full of people who saw me as an inconvenience, trying to find ways to be helpful without being underfoot, as Sarah had put it. I started doing my laundry at odd hours, so I wouldn't tie up the machines when the family needed them. I'd eat my meals quickly and quietly, then retreat to my room so they could have family time without the awkward presence of the grandmother they clearly didn't want around. But the worst part was pretending I didn't know, smiling when Sarah made passive-aggressive comments about personal space, laughing when Daniel made jokes about the household getting crowded, acting grateful when they included me in activities while knowing they were doing it out of obligation rather than love. I started having panic attacks in the middle of the night, lying in that bed and wondering what would happen to me if they actually followed through on their plan to send me away. My Social Security barely covered basic expenses. I had no savings left after helping Daniel with his down payment years ago. I had no other family, no close friends who could take me in. If they decided I had to go, where would I go? The turning point came during Tommy's birthday party. I'd spent days planning the perfect celebration, baking his favorite chocolate cake from scratch despite my aching hands, decorating the backyard with superhero themes, organizing games for his friends. I thought maybe, if I could make it special enough, they'd remember why they used to value having me around. But as I watched the party unfold, I realized I'd become invisible even at an event I'd organized. Parents dropping off their children thanked Sarah for hosting. Kids complimented Daniel on the cool decorations. When someone asked about the amazing cake, Sarah smiled and said, "Oh, I found this wonderful baker who specializes in children's parties." She took credit for my work without a moment's hesitation, and no one in my family corrected her. I excused myself to the bathroom and cried silently while children laughed and played in the backyard I'd transformed for them. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman I barely recognized. Tired, defeated, smaller somehow than I'd been just months before. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and I was cleaning up the party debris that Sarah had somehow overlooked, Daniel found me in the kitchen. For a moment, I hoped he might acknowledge what I'd done, might show some appreciation for the effort I'd put into making his son's day special. Instead, he sat down at the table and said the words that would haunt me for months to come. "Mom, we need to talk about your future." The way he said your future made it clear that their future, the future of his real family, didn't include me. I was about to become a problem they needed to solve, a responsibility they needed to transfer to someone else, a burden they could finally set down. But I wasn't ready to be set down. Not yet. Even though my heart was breaking, even though I felt more alone than I had even in the darkest days after my husband's death, something inside me whispered that this story wasn't over. I just didn't know yet that it was about to get so much worse before it could get better. The conversation Daniel had promised came 3 days later, and it was worse than anything I could have imagined. He didn't even have the courtesy to sit me down in private. Instead, he threw a newspaper on the kitchen table while I was washing the breakfast dishes, the pages scattered across the surface like an accusation. "Mom," he said, his voice cold and businesslike, as if he were firing an employee rather than talking to the woman who had raised him. "You need to start contributing financially, or we're going to have to look into other living arrangements for you." I turned from the sink, soap suds still dripping from my hands, and stared at him. This was my son. The baby I'd nursed through countless sleepless nights. The toddler I'd carried when his legs got tired. The teenager I'd worked double shifts to buy school clothes for. The man I'd given my life savings to so he could afford this house we were standing in. "Other living arrangements?" I whispered, though I already knew what he meant. "There are some very nice assisted living facilities in the area," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Places where you'd have your own space, your own independence, where you could make friends with people your own age." Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding Tommy's backpack like a shield between us. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't Daniel's idea alone. They'd discussed this. They'd planned this moment. "I don't need assisted living," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'm not helpless. I can take care of myself." "Then prove it," Daniel shot back, tapping the newspaper with his finger. "Get a job, start paying rent, show us that you're not just taking up space." Taking up space. Those 3 words hit me like a physical blow. After everything I'd given them, everything I'd sacrificed, I had been reduced to someone who was simply taking up space in their lives. I picked up the newspaper with trembling hands and saw that he'd circled several job listings in red ink. Housekeeping positions, retail clerk jobs, a posting for a part-time cafeteria worker at the local elementary school. All minimum wage positions that would barely cover bus fare, let alone rent in their expensive neighborhood. But what hurt most was seeing those red circles and realizing he'd planned this. He'd sat down with a pen and methodically marked jobs he thought I was capable of. Jobs that would keep me busy and out of their way while generating just enough income to justify my continued presence in their home. "Daniel," I said quietly, "my arthritis makes it hard for me to stand for long periods. My back—" "Everyone has problems, Mom," he interrupted. "Everyone has to work. Sarah works. I work. Even the kids have chores and responsibilities. You're the only one in this house who gets to just exist without contributing anything meaningful." The cruelty of that statement took my breath away. I thought about all the meals I'd cooked, all the clothes I'd washed and folded, all the times I'd picked up sick children from school so Sarah wouldn't have to leave work, all the nights I'd stayed up when someone had a fever or a nightmare, all the ways I'd tried to make their lives easier, smoother, better. None of it had been meaningful to them. None of it had counted as contribution. "I'll start looking," I said, because what else could I say? Where else could I go? That afternoon, I walked to every business within 3 miles of the house. The supermarket where I'd shopped for their groceries for 3 years. The dry cleaner where I'd taken Daniel's suits. The coffee shop where I'd bought treats for the children. At each stop, I filled out applications with my 62-year-old hands that shook slightly from arthritis, my address that wasn't really mine, my employment history that had a decades-long gap because I'd been raising my son and then caring for my dying husband. The responses were polite, but clear. "We'll call you if anything opens up. We're looking for someone with more recent experience. This position requires standing for 8-hour shifts. Are you sure you can handle that?" At the grocery store, a manager young enough to be my grandson looked at my application and said, "We really need someone who can work nights and weekends. Would that be a problem with your family situation?" I wanted to laugh. My family situation was the problem. My family situation was what had driven me here, desperate for any job that would prove I deserved to exist in their space. "No," I said. "No problem at all." But there was a problem. Every rejection felt like confirmation of what Daniel and Sarah already believed, that I was useless, outdated, taking up space that could be better used by someone younger, stronger, more valuable. I came home empty-handed day after day, watching Daniel's expression grow more impatient and Sarah's smiles become more strained. The children, sensing the tension, began avoiding me altogether. Emma started doing her homework at friends' houses instead of at our kitchen table. Tommy stopped asking me to read him bedtime stories. I was becoming invisible in my own family, erased a little more each day. The final humiliation came during a family dinner 2 weeks into my job search. I'd made pot roast, Daniel's favorite since he was a child, and tried to create the kind of warm family atmosphere I remembered from when he was young. But conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences and the sound of forks scraping against plates. Finally, Emma looked up from her barely touched meal and said, "Grandma, why don't you have a job like other grown-ups?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah and Daniel exchanged a look that said everything about how this topic had been discussed when I wasn't around, how my employment status had become a family concern that even the children were aware of. "I'm trying, sweetheart," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My friend Jessica's grandma works at the library," Emma continued, her 9-year-old directness cutting deeper than any adult cruelty could have. "She says it's important for everyone to have a job so they don't become lazy." I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to correct his daughter, to remind her that I'd worked my entire life, that I'd raised him as a single mother while holding down 2 jobs, that I'd cared for her grandfather during his final illness while managing a household on almost no sleep. Instead, he nodded approvingly at Emma's comment and said, "That's right, sweetie. Everyone needs to contribute." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and felt something inside me finally break. Not my heart. That had been cracking for months. Something deeper. My faith in family, maybe. My belief that love meant anything when times got hard. My trust that the people you sacrifice everything for will remember your sacrifices when you need them most. I was 62 years old, alone in a house full of people who saw me as nothing more than an expense they couldn't afford and a presence they no longer wanted. I had no money, no job prospects, and nowhere else to go. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of a family settling in for the night around me, I made a decision. I might not be able to change their minds about me, But I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I wasn't going to let them erase me without a fight. I just had no idea how much I was going to have to endure before I could find my way back to myself. The eviction notice came on a Monday morning in April, delivered not by Daniel personally, but slipped under my bedroom door like a hotel bill. I found it when I woke up, the white envelope stark against the dark hardwood floor, my name written in Daniel's careful handwriting. The same handwriting I'd helped him practice when he was 7 years old, forming letters at our kitchen table while I made encouraging sounds about how smart and capable he was. Maria Santos, the letter began, not Mom, or even Mother, but my full legal name, as if I were a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. Due to your inability to secure employment and contribute to household expenses, we regretfully inform you that your residency in our home will terminate in 30 days. We trust you understand this decision is necessary for our family's financial stability. Our family. Not his family, which would have included me, but their family. Daniel, Sarah, Emma, and Tommy. I had been quietly erased from the definition of family, reduced to a tenant who couldn't make rent. I sat on my bed holding that letter for I don't know how long, reading it over and over, trying to understand how the boy I'd raised could write such cold, clinical words to his own mother. 30 days. 30 days to find somewhere to go with no money, no job, and no one who cared enough to help me. The worst part wasn't even the eviction itself. It was the cowardice of it. Daniel couldn't even look me in the eye and have this conversation. He'd reduced the end of our relationship to a piece of paper slipped under a door, like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person who deserved basic dignity. That morning at breakfast, nobody mentioned the letter. Daniel ate his cereal while scrolling through his phone. Sarah packed the children's lunches with mechanical efficiency. Emma and Tommy argued about something trivial while I sat at the table, invisible, holding the secret of my upcoming homelessness like a stone in my chest. "Could you pick up my dry cleaning today?" Sarah asked without looking at me, as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't helped write my eviction notice just hours before. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. I would pick up her dry cleaning. I would fold her laundry and sweep her floors and cook dinner for people who were counting down the days until they could get rid of me. Because where else was I going to go? What else was I going to do? The next 3 weeks were a special kind of torture. I called every assisted living facility within 50 miles, only to discover that even the most basic accommodations cost more per month than my entire Social Security check. I contacted churches, community organizations, senior services, anyone who might have resources for women in my situation. "Do you have family who could help?" they all asked. And I had to explain that my family was the problem, not the solution. I applied for subsidized housing and was told the waiting list was 18 months long. I looked into shared housing situations and found ads seeking young professional roommates, or graduate students only. I was too old, too poor, too broken to fit anywhere. Meanwhile, life in the house continued around me like I was already gone. Sarah started referring to my room as the guest room, in casual conversation. Daniel began talking about his plans to convert the space into a home office. Emma asked if she could have my dresser for her Barbie collection once I moved out. They were carving up my existence before I'd even left, dividing my space and possessions like I was already dead. The breaking point came during what I didn't know would be my last Sunday dinner with them. I'd made my grandmother's recipe for chicken and dumplings, a dish that had been Daniel's favorite throughout his childhood. Something I'd taught him represented love and tradition and the importance of family gathering around a table together. But as we sat there eating, Daniel announced that he'd gotten a promotion at work. "This means we can finally afford that vacation to Disney World we've been planning," Sarah said, her eyes bright with excitement. "And maybe we can renovate the kitchen next year." I listened to them make plans with money that my departure would help them save, talking about improvements to the house I'd helped them buy, discussing a future that pointedly didn't include me. They were celebrating my eviction without actually saying so. "Grandma, are you excited about your new place?" Emma asked innocently. And the question hit me like a slap, because it revealed how thoroughly they'd prepared the children for my absence. "I don't have a new place yet, sweetheart," I said quietly. The table went silent. Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Sarah suddenly became very interested in cutting Tommy's chicken into smaller pieces. "But you have to move out next week," Emma continued with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Daddy said you found somewhere nice to live." I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to explain, to show some sign that he cared what happened to his mother after he threw her out. But he just set down his fork and said, "I'm sure Mom has everything figured out." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house in the darkness, touching surfaces I'd cleaned thousands of times, standing in rooms where I'd read bedtime stories and bandaged scraped knees and celebrated birthdays and Christmas mornings. I was memorizing a home I was about to lose, saying goodbye to the only family I had left. In the kitchen, I found myself staring at the refrigerator covered with Emma's artwork and Tommy's school papers, a collage of childhood that I'd helped create but would no longer be part of. There were photos from family gatherings, school events, everyday moments of happiness that I'd witnessed and supported and made possible through countless small acts of love and service. But there were no recent photos of me. Looking at that refrigerator, I realized I'd been slowly erased from their visual history over the past months, cropped out of their story one picture at a time. I opened the refrigerator and saw the leftovers from dinner, the chicken and dumplings I'd made with such hope, thinking maybe this meal could remind them of who I used to be to this family. Most of it was still there, barely touched. Even my cooking, once so appreciated, had become just another unwanted offering from someone they couldn't wait to forget. Standing there in my nightgown at 3 a.m, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd built and was about to lose, I felt something inside me finally surrender. Not my spirit, that was stronger than they knew, but my illusions, my desperate hope that love could overcome selfishness, my belief that family meant something more than convenience and financial benefit. I closed the refrigerator and walked back to my room, where I sat on the bed and stared at the suitcase I'd pulled from the closet, but couldn't bring myself to fill. 7 days left. 7 days to figure out where a 62-year-old woman with no money and no prospects goes when her own family throws her away. But as I sat there in the darkness, something unexpected flickered in my chest. Not hope exactly. I wasn't ready for hope yet, but something harder. Something that felt like steel being forged in fire. They thought they could discard me like yesterday's newspaper. They thought I would disappear quietly and conveniently, grateful for the years they'd allowed me to take up space in their lives. They had no idea what I was made of. They had forgotten that I'd survived harder things than this. They didn't remember that I was the woman who'd raised a son as a single mother, who'd worked 2 jobs while going to nursing school at night, who'd nursed a husband through terminal cancer without breaking. I might not know where I was going, but I was beginning to remember who I was. And that woman, the real Maria, the one they'd tried to erase, she wasn't going down without a fight. The morning of my eviction, I woke up before dawn and did something I hadn't done in months. I looked at myself in the mirror. Really looked. The woman staring back at me was someone I barely recognized. Her shoulders were curved inward, as if she were trying to make herself smaller. Her eyes held a defeated expression that made me angry at myself for allowing them to dim my light so completely. But as I stood there in the bathroom I was about to lose access to forever, something shifted. Maybe it was the finality of it all, or maybe it was simply that I'd reached the bottom and had nowhere left to fall. Whatever it was, I straightened my shoulders and spoke to my reflection. "You are not worthless," I whispered to the woman in the mirror. "You are not a burden. You are not taking up space. You are Maria Santos, and you survived things that would have broken weaker people." As I said those words, memories came flooding back. Not the recent memories of rejection and cruelty, but older ones, stronger ones. I remembered working double shifts at the hospital while Daniel was in high school, my feet swollen and aching, but my determination unwavering because I knew education was his ticket to a better life. I remembered sitting in that same hospital parking lot during my lunch breaks, eating peanut butter sandwiches, and studying for my nursing exams by the interior light of my old car. I remembered the night my husband died, when Daniel was away at college, and I sat alone in that hospital room, holding the hand of the man I'd loved for 23 years, promising him I'd be strong enough to face whatever came next. I'd kept that promise for 8 years. I wasn't about to break it now. That morning, instead of packing with the frantic desperation I'd been feeling all week, I moved with deliberate calm. I folded my clothes carefully, the way my mother had taught me, with respect for the fabric, with attention to detail, with the understanding that how you treat your possessions reflects how you value yourself. I packed my photo albums not as memories of a life I was losing, but as evidence of a life I'd lived fully and with purpose. I found the box where I'd stored my nursing school certificates, my employment commendations from the hospital, letters of recommendation from supervisors who'd respected my work and my character. I hadn't looked at these documents in years, but holding them now reminded me that I'd once been someone people relied on, someone whose skills were valued, someone who made a difference in other people's lives. There was one letter in particular that made me pause. It was from Mrs. Elizabeth Chen, written 28 years ago when I was just starting my nursing career. Her daughter had been in a car accident, and I'd been assigned to her care during the critical first week of her recovery. The letter thanked me for my compassion, my expertise, and what she called my healing presence that had helped not just her daughter's body recover, but her family's spirit as well. "You have a gift," Mrs. Chen had written. "You see people not just as patients, but as whole human beings deserving of dignity and hope. Never lose that gift. The world needs more people like you." I'd forgotten about that letter, buried as it was under years of self-doubt and recent humiliation. But reading it now, I felt something awakening in my chest that had been dormant for too long. I had gifts. I had value. I had spent decades helping people heal, and somewhere along the way, I'd lost sight of my own worth. When Daniel came downstairs that morning, he found me sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a small suitcase beside my chair. I was dressed in my best outfit, not the tired, shapeless clothes I'd been wearing lately, but the navy blue dress I'd worn to job interviews years ago, the one that made me feel professional and capable. "Ready to go?" he asked, not meeting my eyes, checking his watch as if my departure were just another appointment on his schedule. "Almost," I said calmly. I wanted to say goodbye properly. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping to avoid any emotional scenes that might complicate what he'd worked so hard to make seem like a simple business transaction. "And I wanted to thank you," I continued, watching his face carefully. "Thank me?" He looked confused, maybe even a little guilty. "For reminding me who I really am," I said, standing up and smoothing my dress. For the past 3 years, I let myself believe that my worth was tied to how much I could do for other people, how useful I could make myself, how small I could become to fit into spaces where I wasn't really wanted. "But you've taught me something important, Daniel." He was staring at me now, perhaps noticing for the first time in months that his mother was speaking to him as an equal rather than pleading with him as a dependent. "You've taught me that I can't earn love by shrinking myself. That respect can't be bought with service. That family isn't something you can purchase by sacrificing everything you are for people who don't value what you're giving them." Sarah appeared in the doorway, probably drawn by the unfamiliar tone in my voice. Calm, measured, certain. "I spent 25 years working as a nurse," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I helped thousands of people through their darkest moments. I saved lives. I brought comfort to families watching their loved ones suffer. I was good at my job, not just competent, but gifted, and I earned the respect of doctors, patients, and colleagues who understood my value." Daniel's mouth opened as if he wanted to interrupt, but no words came out. "Then I spent 18 years raising you as a single mother while working full-time, making sure you had everything you needed to succeed. I sacrificed my own career advancement, my own social life, my own dreams, to give you the foundation you needed to build the life you have now." I picked up my suitcase, its weight suddenly feeling manageable rather than overwhelming. "And then I spent the last 8 years caring for your father while he was dying, managing his medications, coordinating his appointments, making sure he died with dignity while you were too busy building your career to visit more than once a month." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Even the children who'd been getting ready for school upstairs seemed to sense that something significant was happening and had gone quiet. "I am not a burden," I said, looking directly into Daniel's eyes for the first time in months. "I am not worthless. I am not taking up space. I am a woman who has spent her entire life giving to others. And the fact that you can't see that value says everything about who you've become and nothing about who I am. I walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. The woman you're throwing out today is the same woman who sat up all night when you had pneumonia at age 12, who worked overtime for 6 months to buy you a car for graduation, who gave you her life savings for the down payment on this house. I'm the woman who taught you about kindness, about loyalty, about the importance of family taking care of each other. My voice didn't waver, didn't break, didn't plead. Someday, Daniel, when life gets hard for you, and it will, you'll remember what it felt like to have someone who loved you unconditionally, and you'll realize what you threw away today. I opened the front door and stepped outside into the morning sunlight. Behind me, I could hear Sarah whispering urgently to Daniel, but I didn't turn around to hear what they were saying. Whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't walking out of that house as someone small and defeated. I was leaving as Maria Santos, a woman with a history, with skills, with value that existed completely independent of their recognition or approval. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew who I was going as. And that made all the difference. I spent my first night of freedom in a women's shelter downtown, but it didn't feel like defeat anymore. The bed was narrow, and the room was shared with 3 other women, but when I lay down that first evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the peace of comfort or security, but the deeper peace that comes from finally being authentic, from speaking truth instead of swallowing lies, from choosing dignity over desperation. The other women in the shelter had stories that echoed mine in different ways. There was Carmen, 68, whose daughter had stolen her Social Security checks and left her homeless. Betty, 71, whose son had promised to care for her but instead emptied her bank account and disappeared. Margaret, 59, whose family had simply grown tired of her presence after her husband's death. We were the invisible women, the discarded mothers and grandmothers, the casualties of families who saw us as burdens rather than blessings. But sitting around that shelter's small common room in the evenings, sharing stories and instant coffee, I began to see something remarkable. We were also survivors. We were women who had weathered storms our children couldn't even imagine, and we were still standing. During the day, I started visiting the public library, not to apply for more minimum wage jobs that would barely pay for a studio apartment, but to research something that had been growing in my mind since I'd reread that letter from Mrs. Chen. I began looking into what it would take to return to nursing after an 8-year gap. The requirements were daunting. I'd need to complete continuing education courses, pass competency exams, and undergo supervised clinical hours to reactivate my license. Most programs were designed for younger people with flexible schedules and family support, not for 62-year-old women living in shelters. But as I read through the requirements, making notes on library scratch paper, I felt something stirring that I'd almost forgotten: ambition. Not the desperate scrambling I'd been doing for months, trying to find any job that would prove my worth to Daniel and Sarah, but genuine professional ambition. The desire to return to work that mattered, that used my skills, that reminded me why I'd chosen nursing in the first place. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when I was walking to the library and saw an ambulance parked outside a small medical clinic. The paramedics were wheeling out an elderly man who was conscious but clearly in distress, and I found myself moving toward them without thinking, my nursing instincts overriding 8 years of dormancy. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" I heard one of the paramedics ask. But the man seemed confused and agitated. Without really deciding to do it, I stepped closer and knelt beside the stretcher. "Hello, sweetheart," I said to the man in the gentle voice I'd perfected over 25 years of nursing. "My name is Maria. I'm a nurse. You're going to be just fine, but we need to help you feel better, okay?" Something in my tone seemed to calm him immediately. He focused on my face and nodded, his breathing becoming less labored. "Can you squeeze my hand?" I asked, taking his fingers in mine and feeling for his pulse while maintaining eye contact. "That's perfect. You're doing great." I stayed with him, asking simple questions to assess his cognitive function, keeping him calm and oriented while the paramedics completed their evaluation. When they loaded him into the ambulance, the lead paramedic turned to me. "Are you at the clinic?" he asked. No, I said. I used to be a nurse. Used to be? He looked at me more carefully. Ma'am, you still are. That was textbook patient interaction. Where did you practice? I told him about my years at General Hospital, and his eyes lit up with recognition. I know some of the nurses who work there. They always talk about the older staff who really knew their stuff. What year did you leave? When I explained about caring for my husband and then helping with my family, he nodded with understanding that surprised me. My mom's a nurse too, he said. Took time off when my dad got sick. It's hard to come back after a gap, but the good ones never really lose it. He handed me his card. If you're thinking about returning to nursing, there's a woman named Dr. Patricia Williams who runs a program for nurses re-entering the workforce. Tell her Mike Rodriguez recommended you. That evening at the shelter, I stared at the card he'd given me. Dr. Patricia Williams, Director of Nursing Excellence, Mercy General Hospital. The address was across town, in a part of the city I'd never had reason to visit. But something about the encounter with the paramedic felt like a sign, like the universe was finally offering me a path forward instead of another dead end. The next morning, I took 2 buses to reach Mercy General Hospital. It was newer than the hospital where I'd worked, with modern equipment and bright, clean spaces that immediately felt familiar despite being completely foreign. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax, the sound of monitors beeping and overhead pages, the purposeful movement of staff, it all awakened something in me that had been sleeping for years. Dr. Williams turned out to be a woman about my age, with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes that suggested she'd seen enough of life to understand its complexities. When I told her about Mike Rodriguez's recommendation and explained my situation, she listened without judgment, asking practical questions about my experience and my current circumstances. The re-entry program is intensive, she warned me. 60 hours of classroom work, 40 hours of supervised clinical practice, and a comprehensive exam. It's designed to update nurses on new technologies and procedures, but it's also demanding enough to weed out people who aren't serious about returning to the profession. I'm serious, I said. And hearing those words come out of my mouth with such certainty surprised even me. The program doesn't start for 6 weeks, she continued, and there's no financial assistance available. Can you manage the tuition and living expenses during that time? That was the question I'd been dreading. The program cost $3,000, money I didn't have and couldn't see any way to acquire. My face must have shown my disappointment, because Dr. Williams leaned forward in her chair. There might be another option, she said slowly. We have a partnership with a local nursing home that's chronically understaffed. They sometimes sponsor promising candidates through the re-entry program in exchange for a commitment to work for them afterward. It's not glamorous work, and the pay is lower than hospital nursing, but it would get you back into the profession, nursing home work. It wasn't what I'd envisioned when I'd imagined returning to nursing, but it was honest work using my skills, work that mattered to people who needed care and compassion. I'd like to meet with them, I said. That afternoon, Dr. Williams drove me to Sunset Manor, a 100-bed facility that served elderly residents with varying levels of care needs. The director of nursing, a tired-looking woman named Janet, showed me around the facility while explaining their staffing challenges. We're down 4 nurses, she said, as we walked through hallways lined with wheelchairs and the soft murmur of conversations between residents and family members. Good nurses don't want to work in long-term care anymore. The pay is lower than hospitals, the work is demanding, and frankly, society doesn't value what we do here. Oh, but as we walked through the facility, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: recognition. These elderly residents, some confused, some lonely, some forgotten by families who found visiting too inconvenient. They reminded me of myself. They were people whose value wasn't immediately obvious to the outside world. People who needed someone to see them as whole human beings rather than problems to be managed. If I sponsored your re-entry program, Janet said, I'd need a 2-year commitment. The pay starts at $18 an hour, which I know isn't much, but there's health insurance and retirement benefits. And if you prove yourself, there's room for advancement. $18 an hour. It was more than I'd have made at any of the retail jobs I'd been desperately applying for. And it was work that would use my education and experience. More importantly, It was work that would remind me every day that I had value, that my skills could make a difference in people's lives. "I accept," I said, and as the words left my mouth, I felt a shift inside my chest, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place after months of being scattered. That night, back at the shelter, I called the one person I thought might want to know about this development. My finger hovered over Daniel's number for a long time before I realized I didn't need his approval or recognition anymore. This wasn't about proving myself to them. This was about rebuilding myself for me. Instead, I wrote a letter, not to Daniel, but to my future self, the nurse I was about to become again. I promised her that I would work hard, that I would remember why I'd chosen this profession in the first place, and that I would never again let anyone convince me that my worth was tied to their opinion of me. 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, I would start classes that would give me back my profession, my independence, and my sense of purpose. 6 weeks to prepare for a life that would be completely different from anything I'd imagined when I was living in Daniel's house, trying to make myself small enough to deserve their tolerance. I was no longer asking for permission to exist. I was claiming my right to thrive. 8 months later, I was walking through the corridors of Sunset Manor in my crisp white uniform, my nursing badge proudly displayed, when I received the call that would change everything. I had successfully completed the re-entry program, passed all my exams with scores that impressed even Dr. Williams, and had been promoted to charge nurse on the evening shift. My life had found its rhythm again, meaningful work, a small but comfortable apartment I could afford, and most importantly, the restored knowledge of my own worth. The phone rang at the nurse's station just as I was reviewing medication schedules for the night shift. Janet answered, spoke briefly, then turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Maria, there's a situation in the emergency room. They're bringing in a man who's having some kind of breakdown, lost his job, facing foreclosure, apparently hasn't been taking care of himself. His family is requesting someone bilingual who's good with crisis intervention. Are you available to go over and assist?" Emergency room consultations weren't unusual. Sometimes nursing home staff were called to help with elderly patients or family situations that required specialized understanding. I agreed without thinking much about it, gathered my things, and took the shuttle to the main hospital. But when I walked into the emergency room and saw the man sitting on the examination table, his head in his hands, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained, my steps faltered. Even with his back to me, even though he looked smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen him, I knew immediately who it was. Daniel. My son was sitting in that emergency room looking exactly the way I had felt 8 months ago. Lost. Desperate. Abandoned by the people he'd trusted most. A nurse approached me, consulting her chart. "Are you the nursing consultant?" The patient is Daniel Morrison, 34 years old. He was brought in by his wife after what appears to be a mental health crisis. He's been unemployed for 3 months, they're facing foreclosure, and according to his wife, he's been refusing to eat or take care of basic hygiene. I stared at my son through the glass partition, watching him rock slightly back and forth in a gesture of distress I remembered from his childhood, when things felt too overwhelming for him to handle. The irony was so profound it took my breath away. Daniel was experiencing exactly what he'd put me through, and the universe had arranged for me to be the professional called in to help him. His wife mentioned that his mother is unavailable to assist with the family crisis. The nurse continued, clearly choosing her words carefully. Apparently there was some kind of falling out. She seems to think having a mature, experienced female nurse might provide some stability he needs right now. Unavailable. Sarah had told the hospital staff that I was unavailable. Not that they'd thrown me out. Not that they'd abandoned me when I needed them most. They'd rewritten history to make my absence seem like my choice, rather than their cruelty. "I'll speak with him," I said, my voice professional and calm despite the storm of emotions churning in my chest. When I walked into his room, Daniel looked up and our eyes met for the first time in 8 months. The transformation in his appearance was shocking. This successful, confident man who'd dismissed me as worthless was now gaunt, unshaven, wearing the same hollow expression I'd seen in my own mirror during the worst days of my own crisis. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could see him processing my presence. The uniform, the badge, the confident way I carried myself, so different from the broken woman he'd evicted from his home. "Mom," he whispered, as if he wasn't sure I was real. "Hello, Daniel," I said, maintaining the professional demeanor that had become second nature during my months at Sunset Manor. "I'm here as part of the hospital's crisis intervention team. I understand you're going through a difficult time." He stared at me, clearly struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with his last memory of me. Defeated, pleading, desperate for his approval. This version of me was someone he'd never met. Self-possessed, professionally accomplished, speaking to him not as his needy mother but as a healthcare provider offering assistance. "I don't understand," he said. "You're a nurse? But you couldn't find work. I was never unemployable, Daniel," I said gently but firmly. "I was simply in an environment where my value wasn't recognized. Once I removed myself from that environment, opportunities became available." The truth of that statement hung in the air between us. He'd convinced himself that I was worthless, that my inability to find work proved his judgment correct. But here I was, 8 months later, employed in a position that required intelligence, skill, and responsibility. Everything he'd claimed I didn't possess. "I lost my job," he said, his voice breaking. "The company downsized. Sarah left me yesterday. She took the kids. She said I was becoming a burden, that she couldn't handle watching me fall apart. She said I needed to figure out my life before she could figure out our marriage." The parallels were so exact they felt like cosmic justice. Sarah had used almost the same words on him that he'd used on me. The woman he'd chosen to support in discarding his mother had now discarded him using identical logic. "I'm sorry you're going through this," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything he'd done to me, seeing him in such pain activated every maternal instinct I'd spent decades developing. Loss of employment and family separation are significant life stressors. "What kind of support system do you have right now?" He laughed bitterly. "Support system? Sarah made sure all our friends knew about my failure before she left. Her family never liked me anyway. And my mother." He looked at me with something that might have been shame. "My mother is apparently unavailable." "Perhaps," I said carefully. "Your mother is exactly where she needs to be." I pulled up a chair and sat down, close enough to offer professional support, but maintaining appropriate boundaries. This was perhaps the most important conversation of both our lives, and I was determined to handle it with the grace and wisdom I'd learned through my own recovery. "Daniel, I want you to understand something. The fact that you're in crisis doesn't make you worthless. The fact that your wife left doesn't mean you're unlovable. The fact that you lost your job doesn't mean you're incompetent. Sometimes life overwhelms us, and we need help getting back on our feet." He was listening intently now, perhaps hearing in my words the compassion he'd failed to show me when I'd needed it most. "But," I continued, "recovery requires taking responsibility for how we've treated the people who loved us. It requires understanding that when we're cruel to others during their vulnerable moments, we damage relationships that might have sustained us during our own dark times." "I was cruel to you," he said suddenly, the words coming out like a confession he'd been holding back for months. "God, Mom, I was so cruel. I convinced myself that you were the problem, that you were dragging us down, but you were just getting older and needed understanding. You needed what I'm asking for now." This was the moment I'd imagined during my darkest nights at the shelter. Daniel finally seeing the truth, finally acknowledging what he'd done, finally understanding the pain he'd caused. But sitting there in my nursing uniform, secure in my own worth and professional identity, I realized something surprising. I didn't need his apology to feel whole. I'd already forgiven him, not for his sake but for mine, because carrying anger was a burden I'd chosen to set down. "I know," I said simply, "and I forgive you." The words seemed to break something open in him, and he started crying, deep, ugly sobs that sounded like they were coming from a place of profound shame and regret. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. "I threw away the best person in my life because I was too arrogant to see what I had. And now, when everything's falling apart, you're the one they call to help me. You're successful. You're respected. You're everything I prevented you from being." "I'm everything I always was," I corrected gently. "I just needed the space to remember it." 6 months after that night in the emergency room, Daniel stood in the lobby of Sunset Manor, holding a bouquet of flowers and wearing the kind of nervous expression I remembered from his childhood when he'd done something wrong and needed to make amends. But this wasn't the same man who'd thrown me out of his house with a coldly written eviction notice. This was someone who'd been humbled by life, who'd learned the difference between pride and dignity, who understood that love isn't something you earn through success, but something you nurture through respect. I watched him through the glass doors of my office, where I was reviewing patient charts in my new role as Assistant Director of Nursing. The promotion had come 3 months earlier, along with a salary that not only allowed me to live comfortably, but to save money for the first time in years. More importantly, it came with the recognition that I was gifted at what I did: managing staff, advocating for residents, creating care plans that treated elderly people as whole human beings rather than medical problems to be solved. When Daniel finally worked up the courage to approach the front desk, I heard him ask for me in the hesitant voice of someone who wasn't sure he'd be welcome. The receptionist, knowing our history, looked toward my office with raised eyebrows. I nodded, and she directed him to where I was waiting. "Hello, Daniel," I said as he entered my office, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "These are beautiful," I added, accepting the flowers with genuine appreciation. They were daffodils, my favorite, though I was surprised he remembered. "I remembered you always planted them in our garden," he said quietly, before I forgot to notice things like that. He looked around my office, taking in the diplomas on the wall, the commendation letters from the state health department, the photos of residents whose lives I'd helped improve through better care protocols. This was tangible evidence of a success that had nothing to do with his approval or recognition. "I've been in therapy," he said, settling into the chair but maintaining the respectful distance of someone who understood he was a guest in my space rather than someone entitled to my time. Dealing with the depression, but also trying to understand how I became someone who could treat his own mother the way I treated you. I listened without judgment, the way I'd learned to listen to families struggling with difficult decisions about their loved ones' care. Sometimes people needed to confess their failures before they could move forward, and I'd become skilled at creating space for that kind of honesty. "The therapist helped me see that I'd turned you into a symbol of everything I was afraid of becoming," he continued. "Dependent, unsuccessful, forgotten. I was so terrified of ending up like that myself that I convinced myself you deserved it, that you'd somehow chosen it. It was easier than admitting that circumstances can humble anyone, that security is more fragile than we want to believe." This was insight I hadn't expected from him, the kind of self-awareness that can only come from genuine reflection and professional guidance. The Daniel I'd known had always been more comfortable with blame than introspection. "I lost everything, Mom. The job, the house, Sarah, the kids. And when I was sitting in that emergency room feeling like my life was over, you walked in wearing that uniform. So professional and competent and whole. I realized that while I'd been falling apart, you'd been rebuilding yourself into someone even stronger than before." "Not stronger," I corrected gently. "The same strength I always had. I just finally had the space to use it properly." He nodded, understanding the distinction. "Sarah took Emma and Tommy to her mother's house. She filed for divorce last month. She won't let me see the children unsupervised because she says I'm unstable. Which I probably am, but..." He paused, looking directly at me for the first time since entering my office. "I keep thinking about how I must have looked to Emma and Tommy when I was treating you that way. What kind of example I was setting for them about how to treat people when they need help." This was perhaps the most important realization he could have had, that his cruelty hadn't existed in a vacuum, that his children had witnessed him discarding someone who loved him, that he'd taught them lessons about loyalty and family that would shape how they treated others throughout their lives. "Children learn more from what we do than what we say," I agreed. "They're always watching how we handle power, how we treat people who depend on us, how we respond when others are vulnerable." "I got a job," he said, straightening slightly with what looked like tentative pride. "It's not what I used to do. I'm managing a small accounting office for a nonprofit that helps low-income families with tax preparation. The pay is about half what I used to make. But it's honest work, and it feels good to help people instead of just managing money for people who already have plenty." I smiled at this, recognizing the transformation that often comes when people are forced to reassess their values and priorities. That sounds meaningful. It is. And I found a small apartment near downtown. Nothing fancy, but it's mine, and I'm paying for it myself. I'm learning to live within my means instead of constantly trying to appear more successful than I actually was. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us understanding that this conversation was about more than just updating each other on our circumstances. This was Daniel's attempt to apologize not just with words, but with evidence of genuine change. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said finally. "I don't expect you to want a relationship with me. I know I killed something between us that might never come back. But I needed you to know that I understand what I did was wrong, that I'm getting help, and that I'm trying to become someone worthy of the mother who raised me." This was the moment I'd dreamed of during those awful months when I'd felt invisible and worthless in his house. But now that it was happening, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph or vindication, but a deep sadness for all the time we'd lost to his pride and my desperation for his approval. "Daniel," I said, leaning forward slightly, "I forgave you months ago, not because you'd earned it, but because carrying anger was preventing me from fully embracing the life I was building for myself." Relief flooded his face, followed immediately by tears that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. "But," I continued, "forgiveness doesn't mean going back to the way things were. I'm not the same woman you threw out of your house, and you're not the same man who threw me out. If we're going to have a relationship moving forward, it has to be built on who we are now, not who we used to be." "I understand," he said. "I'd like that chance, if you're willing to give it to me. But I want you to know that I'm not asking because I need something from you. I'm asking because I finally understand what I lost, and I'd like the opportunity to know the woman you've become." This was perhaps the first time in our adult relationship that Daniel had approached me as an equal, rather than as someone who either needed his charity or could provide him with services. He was offering to know me as Maria the professional, Maria the independent woman, Maria the person who existed completely separate from her role as his mother. "I'd like that too," I said, "but slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries and mutual respect." He nodded eagerly. "Whatever you need. Whatever feels right to you." As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door of my office. "Mom, thank you for saving my life that night in the emergency room. Not just professionally, but personally. Seeing what you'd accomplished, how you'd survived what I put you through and built something beautiful from it. It gave me hope that maybe I could do the same." After he left, I sat in my office looking at the daffodils he'd brought and thinking about the strange journey that had led us both to this moment. A year ago, I'd been a discarded woman sleeping in a shelter, convinced that my life was over. Now I was a respected professional in a career I loved, financially independent, and being courted for a relationship by the same son who'd once dismissed me as worthless. That evening, I called Mrs. Chen, the woman whose letter had reminded me of my gifts all those months ago. We'd reconnected after I returned to nursing, and she'd become something of a mentor and friend. Someone who understood the particular challenges facing women who rebuild their lives later in life. "How did it go?" she asked, having known about Daniel's planned visit. "Better than I expected," I said. "He's done the work on himself. He understands what he did wrong and why. He's not asking me to rescue him or take care of him. He's asking to know me as the person I am now. And how does that feel?" I considered the question carefully. "Like justice," I said finally. "Not the kind of justice that comes from revenge or watching someone suffer, but the deeper kind that comes from living well, from proving that you're more than other people's worst opinions of you, from choosing dignity even when others choose cruelty." 3 months later, Emma and Tommy came to visit me at Sunset Manor, brought by Daniel as part of his supervised visitation. They were shy at first, unsure how to relate to this grandmother who looked so different from the woman they remembered, confident instead of apologetic, busy instead of desperately available, respected instead of tolerated. But children adapt quickly, and by the end of the afternoon, they were helping me organize activities for the residents, delighting in being useful to people who genuinely appreciated their help. As I watched Emma patiently reading to Mrs. Patterson and Tommy carefully watering the plants in our garden, I realized they were learning new lessons about kindness, about the value of older people, about finding meaning in service to others. "Grandma," Emma said as they were preparing to leave, "Daddy says you help take care of people here because you're really good at making people feel better." "I try," I said, kneeling to her level. "Everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and respect, especially when they're going through difficult times." She nodded solemnly, and I saw in her expression that she understood this was about more than just my work at the nursing home. We were talking about the kind of person she wanted to become, the kind of family member she wanted to be. As I watched Daniel drive away with my grandchildren, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace with my past and excitement about my future. I'd learned that justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like refusing to be diminished by other people's cruelty. Sometimes it looks like rebuilding yourself so completely that the people who hurt you have no choice but to see your worth. I was no longer asking for their love or approval. I was offering mine, freely and without conditions, to the family they were choosing to become. And that, I realized, was the most complete victory of all.